There is an article in today's The Hindu. UN takes new measures to fight climate change, and that measure is that the Executive Council of World Meteorological Organization has endorsed a plan. They have made a resolution regarding this to come up with a new global greenhouse gas monitoring infrastructure. This will help to fulfill the critical gaps that exist in the information sharing and dissemination. Because at present, there are no comprehensive, timely international exchange of surface and space-based greenhouse gas observation data. And hence, there is an urgent need for such an arrangement to spring up so that we can track the success of the targets that we have set in 2015 Paris Agreement. Also, last year in 2022, World Meteorological Organization has reported the largest ever observed increase in methane. Methane is a very potent greenhouse gas, but the reason for this increase is still not well understood. So one of the functions of this new global greenhouse gas monitoring infrastructure would be to help fill the gaps which we have in our knowledge regarding the observations and regarding usefulness of that observation, meaning interpretation of that observation in a meaningful manner, so that we really understand how one factor affects the overall global climate change. Still today, there are uncertainties regarding the role of carbon cycle in the ocean, the role of land biosphere, the forests, and the permafrost areas, the role that they play in the overall carbon cycle and hence the climate change phenomena. We therefore need to undertake greenhouse gas monitoring in an integrated manner. World Meteorological Organization has a rich experience in monitoring greenhouse gases through two means. One is Global Atmosphere Watch. Global Atmosphere Watch basically has multiple ground stations. But now the satellite observation data is also becoming part of Global Atmosphere Watch. It was started in 1989, but largely still today it has ground-based stations. And then there are models to interpret those data. And one of that model is Integrated Global Greenhouse Gas Information System. But under the new plan of Global Greenhouse Gas Monitoring Infrastructure, there would be both ground-based stations and the space-based monitoring stations, and also the new tool and the modeling system to interpret the data that we get from ground-based and space observations. Although it is still a resolution and the Executive Council of World Meteorological Organization finally will have to take the approval from WMO Congress, which is scheduled to be held later this year. But it is envisaged that the greenhouse gas monitoring infrastructure will have 4 components. First of all, there would be set of surface-based and satellite-based observations of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. So through ground-based stations and through satellite monitoring, remote sensing, these 3 gases concentration, column-wise, area-wise, it will be observed. Then modeling techniques will be used to prior estimate the greenhouse gas emission based upon the activity data and process-based data of different regions. And I've just told you that we do not yet properly understand the role that the carbon cycle of ocean, the land biosphere, and the permafrost areas, they play in the overall carbon cycle of the earth and hence in the phenomena of climate change. So the third component of this infrastructure would be a high-resolution Earth system models that will represent the global greenhouse gas cycles. And ultimately, you require a model for calculation. So various modeling techniques would be required so that the data that you are collecting and the theoretical greenhouse gas cycles that we have made, they all can be used in an intelligible manner. There are quite a bit of things that we have to discuss here. First of all, the infrastructure will monitor the concentration of CO2, methane, and N2O, nitrous oxide. So in terms of abundance, the most abundant greenhouse gas is H2O. Then comes carbon dioxide, then comes methane, then comes nitrous oxide, then ozone, and then various fluorides and chlorides that comes out because of many industrial process. Hydrofluorocarbons, perfluorocarbons. The most abundant greenhouse gas is water vapor. But the average residence time of water molecule in the atmosphere is only about 9 days, compared to years or even centuries of most of the greenhouse gases like CO2 and methane. So the overall contribution of each greenhouse gas to the greenhouse effect is determined by the characteristic of the gas, its abundance, and if any of the indirect effect that the gas may cause. The characteristic meaning the nature of bonding. For instance, the greenhouse gas potential of fluorides and chlorides of carbon is very, very high. Similarly, the nature of bonding in methane is such that the structure is tetrahedral. There are 4 carbon-hydrogen bonds, CH4. The carbon dioxide structure is linear. The carbon has 2 double bonds with oxygen, CO2. So one is the inherent nature of the molecule. The other is its stability and the residence time in the atmosphere. The third factor could be the indirect effect that it may cause. For example, methane has a very large indirect radiative effect because it contributes to the formation of ozone. Methane also gets oxidized into CO2. So methane continues to do global warming even after it has vanished from the atmosphere. So the overall global warming potential depends on both the efficiency of the molecule in absorbing the radiation from the earth and re-emitting it and its atmospheric lifetime. You'll find many data regarding this, but largely it is considered that the 3 greenhouse gases that are triggering the climate change presently are carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. Water vapor is not considered to be the greenhouse gas that is triggering the climate change because of the water cycle. The concentration of H2O largely remains the same, and it is not said to be participating in the human-induced climate change. The gases which are causing that are carbon dioxide as number 1, then methane, and then nitrous oxide. You'll find various data. The article that I have referred to for this discussion says that the CO2 accounts for 66% of total greenhouse gas emission. But elsewhere you'll find different data. Somewhere you'll find 76%, somewhere you'll find around 72%. But be whatever it may, carbon dioxide is the most important greenhouse gas. Carbon dioxide is the most important greenhouse gas contributing to human-induced climate change, largely because the lifetime of a molecule of CO2 is very high. Another thing that you must also have observed here, that diatomic molecules are not present in the list. The most abundantly present molecule in the atmosphere is nitrogen, then oxygen, but you don't see them here. Nitrogen is a diatomic molecule having N triple bond N. Oxygen is a diatomic molecule. Hydrogen is also a diatomic molecule. They are not greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases have to be at least triatomic. They must have at least 3 atoms. The reason is that because of diatomic nature, the oscillation between nitrogen and nitrogen is such that it does not absorb the radiation emitted by the earth, and hence they do not participate in global warming. The gas that can participate in the absorption of radiation coming out of the earth, and hence it starts oscillating. So it absorbs and re-emits, and hence, and the re-emitted ones, they do not go outside the atmosphere, and hence they remain trapped. And that's the reason for greenhouse gas, and that's the reason for greenhouse effect. So which gas will absorb which frequency? It depends upon the natural frequency of the gas, and the natural frequency of these are less. The frequency of oscillation of triatomic molecules are higher, and they match up with the radiation that comes from the earth. And that's the reason only triatomic and higher molecules, only they can act as greenhouse gases. UPSC in 2016 had asked a question on neem-coated urea. And in one of the options, it said that nitrous oxide, which is a greenhouse gas, is not at all released into atmosphere by crop fields. Well, this is not the right answer here. The right answer would be neem-coated urea. It is useful because it slows down the rate of dissolution of urea in the soil. But the point is, nitrous oxide is a greenhouse gas. You have to know that because it's a triatomic gas. In 2019, UPSC has asked this question regarding methane hydrate. And in the third statement, it says methane in the atmosphere oxidizes to carbon dioxide after a decade or 2. This is a correct statement. The other 2 statements are also factual and correct. But methane in the atmosphere oxidizes to carbon dioxide after a decade or 2. That's the point. So the most potent greenhouse gas becomes carbon dioxide because methane is not there residing in the atmosphere for more than 2 decades. But carbon dioxide, it could remain there for 300 years to 1000 years. But the efficiency in absorbing and emitting, that for methane is much higher than carbon dioxide. It is around 83 to 85 times more than carbon dioxide. So individually, one molecule of methane is more potent in terms of greenhouse effect. But overall, if you look in the longer time frame, then carbon dioxide gas becomes more important in terms of showing greenhouse gas effect because of high residing time in the atmosphere. So that is one thing about this greenhouse gas monitoring infrastructure, that it is going to observe CO2, methane and N2O. And these gases are written in the order of precedence in terms of their importance for showing greenhouse gas effect. The infrastructure will have surface-based and satellite-based observations. First of all, you have to have a very clear idea that Earth observation satellite, they can observe greenhouse gases as well. UPSC in 2019 has asked a question for the measurement or estimation of which of the following are satellite images or remote sensing data used. Chlorophyll content in the vegetation of a specific location, greenhouse gas emissions from rice paddies of a specific location, and land surface temperature of a specific location. The answer here obviously is option D. All of them can be analyzed using remote sensing data. Greenhouse gas emission from anywhere can be analyzed from remote sensing data. Remote sensing satellites, they take up the infrared radiations. And infrared radiation would depend on temperature, it would depend on color. So the green colored chlorophyll can be identified, the temperature, the radiation corresponding to a particular temperature, that would depend on the natural frequency of vibration of molecules. That can also be identified, and the greenhouse gases, their presence, concentration, everything can be known. And I told you the radiation depends on temperature, it depends on color. So the land surface temperature can also be known. In terms of satellite observation of greenhouse gas, you have to know a very important satellite launched by Japanese Space Agency. It's called as GOSAT, Greenhouse Gases Observing Satellite. GOSAT-2 was launched in 2018 for measurement of concentration of carbon dioxide, methane, and also carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide is CO. And I've told you diatomic gases are not greenhouse gases. It's only triatomic, tetraatomic, and higher ups. But the carbon monoxide can easily be oxidized to carbon dioxide. And hence the indirect radiative effect of carbon monoxide is there. Very easily it can give rise to a greenhouse gas. Regarding GOSAT, you also have to know the first GOSAT satellite was launched in 2009, and it was the first dedicated satellite to observe greenhouse effect gases. Orbiting Carbon Observatory 2, OCO2, is a satellite-based mission. It's a mission of NASA launched in 2014 with the purpose to monitor carbon dioxide gas concentration in Earth's atmosphere. And there's a mission TEMPO, Tropospheric Emissions Monitoring of Pollution. This is a proposed mission of NASA scheduled to be launched this year. This mission, apart from monitoring greenhouse gases, will also monitor pollution level in general, but over North America. And regarding surface-based observation, the most important of all is Global Atmosphere Watch. We have discussed in the beginning that this was the initiative of World Meteorological Organization. It has many ground-based stations, but now some of the satellite-based observation data are also getting integrated into Global Atmosphere Watch program of WMO. It was started in 1989. Integrated Carbon Observation System, it's a European research infrastructure. There are many institutions involved. They monitor and try and understand the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, ocean, and the terrestrial ecosystems. There's one of European Space Agency, the European Space Agency's Climate Change Initiative. It's a long-term project that aims to provide accurate and reliable data to monitor climate variables, including greenhouse gases. And largely, it will bank on the satellite data. But it will also involve new algorithms and new modeling to analyze and interpret the data in an intelligible manner. So finally, after all the data collection from ground stations and the satellite, and after having the theoretical models, we need to analyze the data to fit the theory. And for that, we require algorithms and the modeling systems. But we don't have many of them, and their advancement also has not taken place considerably. In 2016, UPSC has asked a question, what is Greenhouse Gas Protocol? It is not an initiative of UN. Neither it is any intergovernmental initiative, and it is not part of RED+. It is a simple international accounting tool that government and various business houses and research agencies, they all use to understand, quantify, and manage greenhouse gas emissions. It was developed by World Resource Institute and World Business Council for Sustainable Development. But at the level of UN, by World Meteorological Organization or other organizations, or by IPCC, such an advanced tool or any modeling system has not been developed. There is another article in today's newspaper analyzing the post-pandemic Indian economy and its recovery. Basically, it's analyzing the recovery of Indian economy post-pandemic. In this analysis of the Hindu, they have analyzed the recovery of Indian economy post-pandemic with the aid of some graphs. This is year-on-year GDP growth rate. And this bar graph, they represent the four components of GDP. The private consumption, government final consumption expenditure, private consumption expenditure, government final consumption expenditure, gross fixed capital formation, which refers to the procurement of final goods and services, which also means investment, and net exports. See the two peaks here in the first quarter of 2021-2022 and the first quarter of 2022-2023. These peaks are contributed by two factors. The one in blue is investment and the one in dark red is private consumption. So it seems from this graph that the private consumption and investment, these two are the drivers of growth causing the peak in the graph. But once analyzed individually, the study shows that there is divergence in the growth rate and the private final consumption expenditure. The private consumption has divergence with the growth rate everywhere, except for the first quarter of 2022-2023. So by and large, it doesn't seem like the private consumption is pulling up the growth. But if you plot the growth rate with investment, gross fixed capital formation, then we see GFCF or the investment and the growth rate, they are consistent with each other. So the conclusion drawn with these two diagrams is this, that with regard to recovery in the economy, investment is more important than the private final consumption. Or to make the analysis even better, using one indicator, what the study has done is to replace the private consumption or the investment with the credit available in the economy. Because the private consumption that may come from the salary or the saving or also from the private credit. And the investment in the business, in the private sector, in the economy, that also comes from the profit margin or the bank or the institutional credit given to the business houses, the private sector. So combining these two factors, they have tried to plot the growth rate with the credit available in the economy, and it seems that these two graphs are coterminous. So the focus of the study from here goes to credit rather than the four components of GDP. But the credit available in the economy would depend upon the repo rate. And if you compare the repo rate in India and the Fed rate in the US, this is the comparative graph. There's a difference in the repo rate between US and the developing countries. That's why the footloose industry come to developing countries. But when the Fed tapering begins, when the interest rate provided by the Central Bank of United States of America starts to rise, then the money immediately goes away from the developing economy. And this always happens. This means that the Central Bank of US, considered to be the biggest guarantor, it is giving you more interest. So you will feel safe to deposit your money rather than play with the uncertainties in the economy for the return. So if the Federal Reserve Bank of US providing you higher interest rate, it is the safest bet for any investor to deposit money with them in order to earn return. Now, a thing in economy is this. If Fed is increasing the interest rate, RBI will also have to do it. If RBI doesn't do it, then the money will fly like flies away from the Indian economy to the US economy. You understand that the US is considered to be a stable economy and the Central Bank of US is the biggest guarantor. So even if they are guaranteeing low interest rate, people feel safe. And even if the Central Bank of any developing country is guaranteeing high interest rate, confidence would be lesser in the Central Bank of developing countries. Now to make up for that less confidence, an incentive has to be given, meaning higher interest rate must be provided. But if you don't increase your interest rate, keep it constant, despite the fact that the Central Bank of US is increasing the rate, then all the foreign capital will fly back home. So you have to increase it. It is not in your hands. You do not have much of the option here. Now come back to this chart. It has been explained very well that the single most important factor in the recovery of economy post-pandemic is the credit facility. In this chart, it has been drawn as credit as percentage of GDP. And there will be more credit available in the economy when RBI reduces its repo rate. So the banks don't go and deposit money in the RBI, rather they lend it in the market. But as it turns out, in the open economic structures, as is being followed world over, you are not totally independent to follow your monetary policy. If the Fed, for some reason, is increasing the interest rate, you also will have to increase the interest rate. But in the process, you are effectively decreasing the credit in the economy, and credit is crucial for pulling up the growth rate. And the study suggests that now, since the most important goal of monetary policy is inflation targeting, so it seems like the central bank will have to keep up the repo rate even for a longer period of time to control the inflation. And that's going to create problem in the credit availability in the economy. And hence it is suggested that monetary policy alone can't do it. The fiscal policy must become prudent and take up the larger role of pulling up the growth rate in the economy. There is another article in today's newspaper, Tamil Nadu taking steps to ensure safety of migrant workers. You must have been reading about the concern of migrant workers in the state of Tamil Nadu and the clarification coming from the state that the news regarding the violation of rights of the migrant workers are fake news. We will not get into the politics of it. Rather, we shall discuss the issue of migrant workers comprehensively. That will always be important, be whatever the news that might be coming in at any point in time.
See, Niti Aayog, after a wider consultation with many ministries, civil societies, and international organizations like UN Habitat, has come up with a draft national policy on migrant workers. According to the government data given by the Minister of State, Labour and Employment in the Parliament, 10 million labourers had to go back home during the lockdown. And this has brought attention to the issue of governance and administration related to welfare of migrant workers. First of all, according to International Organization for Migration, migrant is any person who moves away from his or her place of usual residence, whether within the country or across an international border, whether temporarily or permanent, for varied reasons. But in our discussion here, we'll be focusing only on internal migrants, or to be specific, interstate migrants. In India, we have large number of inter-district and inter-village migrants. According to Economic Survey of 2017, which discussed the issue in detail, there are around 7 million interstate migrants in India. The number of internal migrants as per 2011 census is very high. Around 455 million people, which is 37% of total population, are migrants. The difference in these two numbers are, the economic survey gave the data of interstate migrants, and 2011 census is actually giving the number for total number of internal migrants, which could be inter-district, inter-village as well. Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh are the states which are the highest source of internal migrants in India, accounting for around 50% of total interstate migrants. 9 million is a huge number if we just consider interstate migrants. But the problem is not only of interstate migrants migrating within the state face similar challenges as interstate migrants, and that number is very high, 37% of total population. And that calls for a national policy on migrant workers. The draft national policy on migrant workers by Niti Aayog has a very important policy stand. The stand is, migration should be acknowledged as an integral part of development. In many developing countries, including India, people and the government have very negative view of migration. So far, the government's effort has been to stop migration. Explicitly and implicitly in the government policy, migration is seen as a problem, and efforts are being taken to generate employment to provide facilities locally so that people do not migrate. But a changed policy stance is that migration should be acknowledged as an integral part of development. This is a very, very important point from the draft policy of Niti Aayog. Migrants are to be seen as agents of development and not a burden on the new place of living. In fact, back in 2017, there was a report given by Working Group on Migration. It was constituted by the then Ministry of Housing and Urban Poverty Alleviation, and this committee in its report also argued that movement from agriculture to manufacturing and then to services was inherently linked to success of migration in the country. And we are also in the stage of transiting our human resource, our manpower, from agriculture towards manufacturing and further towards services. And internal migration will be a natural consequence of this transition. And it is going to be the integral part of the development story that other developing countries and India will see. This already has been seen in the growth story of Southeast and East Asian countries. The positive impact of internal migration in these countries have been recorded, and these countries, as a consequence of that, has seen reduction in poverty. Similarly, mobility, internal migration as a tool to reduce poverty and increase livelihood opportunity has been recorded in many countries in Africa. Migration, internal mobility has been seen to have multiplier effect in the economy and society. It not only results in remittances getting back to the source state, an increase in land and property value, increased urbanization in the destination state, but it also stimulates the labor market of the nation. It allows agricultural transition, opportunity for mechanization, reduction in manpower in agriculture sector. It also strengthens cooperation between the home and the host societies. There is dissemination of skill, the entrepreneurial spirit that people bring back home. There is cultural transmission, cultural diffusion to various parts of the country. And hence, it is observed and duly noted by the report of Niti Aayog that if there is control on population movement, then that is going to hamper the economic growth and poverty reduction process of the nation. So, the report says that government should not hinder but seek to facilitate internal migration. Although there is no barrier on internal migration in India, everybody, all citizens have right to freedom of movement under Article 19 of Indian Constitution, and as such everyone is free to work anywhere in India. But there are some natural and artificial barriers. And if those barriers are not removed, if the process of internal migration mobility is not facilitated, then the hindrances which are already there, they will be present. So government must actively remove these hindrances and facilitate internal mobility for the development of the country. So now we must discuss how that must be done. I have discussed this template previously while many discussions in the DNS. When you do a topic of governance, you can follow this template. It sorts things out and topics look simpler. Let's apply this template to discuss the governance related with issues of migrant workers. We will talk only what Niti Aayog has suggested, but we will organize in a manner that content fits into this template. First of all, for governance in any area, we need to have policy. Policy gives the vision, and it also gives the strategy to implement that vision. The strategy to implement the vision of welfare of migrant workers is a right-based approach that Niti Aayog has put forward. Right-based approach meaning citizens will not be seen as beneficiaries, they will not be just given the dole of financial help, but rather they will have their rights. The right to minimum wage, the right to safe and decent place of work, right against exploitation. But to ensure these rights, there is need for good governance, and good governance is strengthened, is motivated when there is political accountability. Political accountability can be ensured if people are politically inclusive, and one of the tools for that is to give people voting rights. Vote of citizen is a big bargain for good governance from the politicians. Migrant workers, as you would understand, do not have right to vote in the destination state. They cannot vote where they are working, and it is also very difficult to go back to their home for voting. So generally, they have very little support from the host state and also from the home state. Apart from voting right, there is also a need for further and deeper political inclusion of migrant workers in the form of their involvement in preparation of citizen charter, social audit, and participation in local governance. This is a very important strategy for welfare of migrant workers. Ultimately, it is the political inclusion that gives a strength, that gives some bargaining power in the hands of citizens. And this is what Niti Aayog has advocated in the draft national policy on migrant workers. To give a concrete form to the vision of the policy which is implementable, there is need for legislation. So far, the major legislation for welfare of migrant worker is Interstate Migrant Workers Act 1979. But this legislation has been criticized heavily because it is designed to only protect the laborers, migrant workers, from exploitation by contractors. As per the Act, the contractors have to be non-discriminatory with regard to wages, with regard to travel and displacement allowances, and with regard to providing suitable working conditions to all workers, including the migrant workers. But to get the benefit out of Interstate Migrant Workers Act 1979, the migrant workers should be recruited by licensed contractors. If they are working individually, then the law will not be applicable. And unfortunately, you would understand that most of the migrant workers will not be working under licensed contractors. Also, the Act is only applicable to those establishments which has 5 or more interstate migrant workers. So even in establishments having less than 5 migrant workers, the Act is not applicable. The report of Working Group on Migration that was constituted in 2017 and also the present draft of Niti Aayog calls for a comprehensive law for these workers. The present legislation of 1979 is very narrow in its application. So there's a need of new legislation to be brought in that will have provisions implementing the vision of the policy. The legislation in turn will be implemented by good administration. Good administration will require institutional capacity and infrastructure. Presently, the migrant workers are invisible population because they cannot enforce political accountability because they don't have political inclusion. Presently, the state labor departments, they have very little engagement with the issues of migrant workers. There is lack of human resource, there is lack of fund, and there is also lack of coordination among the ministries. There is absence of any administrative setup. So in order to set an administrative machinery that will look after the welfare of migrant workers, Niti Aayog's draft national policy on migrant workers has suggested a structure. On the top, there will be nodal ministry, which will be Ministry of Labour and Employment. This nodal ministry will be coordinating with other ministries like Ministry of Panchayati Raj, Ministry of Rural Development, Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs. They must coordinate with the Ministry of Tribal Affairs to come up with a data on migration of tribal population. That will enable the efficient working of migration resource centers. Migration resource centers have been suggested by Niti Aayog to be opened up in high migration zones and migration corridors. Migration resource centers in coordination with other ministries like Ministry of Skill Development and Entrepreneurship can work on skill building of migrant workers. Similarly, Ministry of Education must take measures under Right to Education Act to mainstream migrant children's education and provide local language teachers to the migrants' destination. Also, Ministry of Labour itself in coordination with NALSA should set up a grievance handling cells that will fast-track legal responses for issues like trafficking, minimum wage violations, and workplace abuses, even accidents. So the nodal ministry, which is Ministry of Labour and Employment, it must carry out inter-ministerial coordination mechanism. And all these ministries in turn must have migration focal points in their working, in their policy design, etc. And the nodal ministry must have migrant workers cells, the central ministry and all the state ministries. This migrant workers cell will be the main body for coordinating, carrying out the function, welfare of migrant workers. It will coordinate with the working of interstate migration management bodies. All these are suggestive bodies, they do not exist. But in the draft policy, Niti Aayog has given a suggestive mechanism to carry out the administration regarding welfare of migrant workers. So under the nodal Ministry of Labour and Employment, there is a suggestion to have a migrant worker cell. And this migrant worker cell will coordinate with interstate migration management bodies, which is also to be established. Migrant worker cell will also coordinate with migration resource centers, will operate national labor helpline, will create awareness, link the worker's household to government schemes, will do the skill mapping, will coordinate with other central ministries to carry out education, to carry out skill development work, etc. etc. The migrant worker cells of one state will coordinate with the migrant worker cells of other states in order to have interstate coordination through the interstate migration management bodies. So this is the administrative setup that Niti Aayog envisaged in the draft national policy on migrant workers. Unless we have this institutional setup, the legislation and the policy cannot be implemented. The administration regarding welfare of migrant workers cannot be done. Once we have the institutional structure, once we have institutional capacity, once we have funds, once we have functionaries, and we have the defined function, then only the administrative tools can be put in motion. The tool like data collection. Both the 2017 report and the present draft report by Niti Aayog, both of them stress on the need for credible data. Data on seasonal and circular migration. Data on migrant-specific variables like the age group, gender, caste, educational status, number of children, etc. etc. The main source of data related with migration is the census data, which comes once a decade. In 2017, Economic Survey made an estimation that was not a data collection from ground. The hard data is only the census data on migration. So the suggestion is that the Registrar General of India must release migration data at least once a year. And that data must not only be interstate, that data must be inter-district, at sub-district level, even at the village level. The periodic survey of National Sample Survey Office that must also include questions related to migration. Without data collection, the condition and the progress of migrant workers cannot be judged, and hence political accountability cannot be enforced. There is also a need of infrastructure development that will aid the administration of welfare of migrant workers. It is suggested that the source states must have some kind of contact points with the migrant workers. Niti Aayog has suggested that the labor officers from the source state can be deputed to the destination. The state of Bihar has experimented by appointing a joint commissioner in the Bihar Bhavan in New Delhi. This kind of joint mechanism of source and destination states can be used for the welfare of migrant workers. As we have discussed before, any initiative for good governance in any area cannot be successful without people's active participation involvement. On the issue related with migrant workers, first thing is there is a lot of negativity with regard to migrants in India. Migration still is perceived to be a negative thing, and efforts are channelized to stop migration. Migration is not seen as a tool for development. Migration is not perceived as an intrinsic part of the growth story of a nation. So first of all, this negative opinion related with migration must be reversed. People must be trained to adopt the culture of new places, to avert any cultural conflict, to generate tolerance in general in society, so that local participation of migrant workers, whether in local governance or in the unions of the destination state, that can be facilitated. India has lakhs and lakhs of trade unions, but only a small minuscule of that are unions of migrant workers. That is also one form of political inclusion. And then, as we have learned before, in any area of governance, you must see how technology can come in aid to governance. In the beginning, we have talked about how voting right can be used for bargain from the politicians. Presently, it's difficult for migrant workers to exercise their right of voting because electronic voting is not common in India. And rightly so, there are risks of rigging of election if there is electronic voting. But using technology like blockchain, mechanism can be created where votes cannot be altered. This is just one technology. You can think of other technologies that can be used for the welfare of migrant workers. We will end from where we began. Migration should be acknowledged as an integral part of development, and government policies must not hinder but seek to facilitate internal migration. We need to adopt a strategy where development and internal migration can be synergized.
There is another news article in today's newspaper, Joshimath to be on the disaster risk reduction meet. And that meet is the session of National Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction. The third conference for National Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction is going to be held in New Delhi next week. So the land subsidence that has happened in the Joshimath in Uttarakhand and the role that National Disaster Response Force NDRF has played in the Turkey earthquake. These topics will be discussed in the third session of National Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction. The theme of the session will be building local resilience in a changing climate. Let's quickly look at some of the points that are relevant for the prelims examination concerning National Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction. Government of India has come up with this platform to adopt a multi-stakeholder approach of consultation, participation, learning from case studies in the realm of disaster management. So this multi-stakeholder body, National Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction, was formed in 2013. This is a body responsible for monitoring the national disaster management policy and various directives and actions that the central government and the state government undertake for disaster management. So the output of this National Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction that gives a strategic direction, a roadmap for disaster management in the country. The platform is chaired by Union Home Minister. As you understand, disaster management comes under the Union Home Ministry. And the minister in charge of disaster management in the Ministry of Home Affairs is the Vice Chairman of National Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction. The Chairman, Home Minister, and the Minister in charge of disaster management is the Vice Chairman. Then there are 15 cabinet members, the Vice Chairman of Niti Aayog, Minister of the State Governments and UTs dealing with disaster management, and then representatives from local self-governments, head of the institutions of national importance, experts from industry. There are media representatives, representation from civil society, and there are international representatives as well. So it's a multi-stakeholder participative platform. The first session of National Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction took place in 2013. It was organized with an objective to encourage the implementation of Hyogo Framework of Action. Hyogo Framework of Action was the blueprint for disaster management for 1 decade, from 2005 to 2015. The second meeting of the platform was held in 2017, again in New Delhi. This time the focus was on developing Prime Minister's 10-point agenda on disaster risk management and integrating its implementation with Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction succeeded the Hyogo Framework. So the framework began in 2015 to be ended in 2030. So Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, that's one. Paris Climate Agreement happened in 2015 and Sustainable Development Goals from 15 to 30. Harmonizing these three frameworks, these three conventions with the Prime Minister's 10-point agenda on disaster risk management, that was the outcome of the second session held in 2017 of the National Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction. Now is going to be happening the third session. And this time around, the target would be to create a coherence between the post-2015 global frameworks, the Sendai Framework, SDG, and now we also have COP21. Now give yourself 3 minutes of time and attempt the speed test in the time limit. The test is of the nature of true or false. There are 10 statements and you have to identify whether they are true or false. So in the stipulated time of 3 minutes, please attempt this test with full of your alacrity, zeal and enthusiasm. And only after that, you listen to the discussion. First statement, state of the global climate. This report is released by World Meteorological Organization. It's the flagship report of WMO and the statement is absolutely true. World Meteorological Organization was the first specialized agency of UN. It is the specialized agency of UN. That's why in the article that we discussed, the title was UN takes new measure. The measure was by the Executive Council of WMO, but it says UN takes new measures. You know that it's a specialized agency of UN, there's no doubt. But it is not the first because it was formed in 1950 and there were many bodies of UN formed prior to this. So the statement is false. Carbon dioxide gas has the highest global warming potential among all greenhouse gases. Actually, it has one of the lowest potential. But because it's there in the atmosphere for such a long period, sometimes even for thousands of years, so the effective greenhouse gas effect that one molecule of CO2 can cause is much higher than any other molecule of any other greenhouse gas. But to say that it has highest global warming potential is false. But to say that it causes the greatest amount of greenhouse gas effect is true. NISAR satellite will observe greenhouse gases. We didn't do NISAR satellite when we did satellite observation of greenhouse gases. NISAR is NASA ISRO synthetic aperture radar, and NISAR satellite will work on radar. You understand that greenhouse gas observation effectively has to be remote sensing. It has to be infrared based observation, not using microwave. So NISAR will actually observe the movement on the earth. It can observe the ocean level going up and down, but not the greenhouse gas concentration, their distribution. The statement will be false. Tropospheric emission monitoring of pollution tempo. It's a NASA Earth Venture instrument and it will be sent to geostationary satellite. When we did tempo, I told you that it is for North American region. And when you have the region fixed, that means that relative to Earth, the satellite or the observation instrument should not move. So obviously the observation instrument will go to geostationary orbit. But otherwise you understand that Earth observation satellites generally do not go to geostationary orbit. But howsoever tempo will go, the statement is true. Greenhouse Gas Observing Satellite 2 is a Japanese satellite launched in 2018 that measures the concentration of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, methane, carbon monoxide in the Earth's atmosphere. It is true that it will observe carbon dioxide, methane, and carbon monoxide, but carbon monoxide is not a greenhouse gas. To say that it will observe greenhouse gases like CO2, methane, and CO is absolutely incorrect because that suggests that CO is a greenhouse gas, which it is not. The National Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction session are headed by Prime Minister. It is absolutely false. It is headed by the Home Minister. The National Disaster Management Plan was the outcome of the first session of National Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction. National Disaster Management Plan was given out in 2016 and the first session happened in 2013. So it was not the outcome of this session, rather some of the discussion may have helped in the formulation of National Disaster Management Plan, but it was not the outcome of this session. The statement is false. Gross fixed capital formation has highest contribution in the GDP and is the most important factor for economic recovery. It is indeed the most important factor for economic recovery relative to the other components of GDP. But it is a private consumption expenditure that has the highest contribution in GDP, not the gross fixed capital formation, not the investment, but the private consumption that has contribution of more than 60%. Statement is false. In the scenario where Fed rate increases and RBI does not increase repo rate, then it is very likely that the import will become expensive. To give incentive to the investors, repo rate has to be higher than the Fed rate. And when the Fed rate rises, then the repo rate also has to adequately rise to keep the gap just the same. When the repo rate does not rise proportionately, then the money starts going back home. And when the money starts going back home, then the rupee will devaluate. How will they take back money? They brought money in dollar. They invested in rupee. Now to go back home, they have to convert the rupee into dollar. So they will ask for dollar. So the demand for dollar will increase, effectively decreasing the demand for rupee. So rupee will devalue. And when the rupee devalues against dollar, your import will become expensive. And this will happen. If you don't increase repo rate, the money will go. RBI had to increase repo rate, but it didn't increase proportionately. So despite increasing repo rate, the money went away. Had the RBI didn't increase, then a lot more money would have gone away. So money will go away if you don't increase your rate, because the economy works as per incentive. And when the money goes away, it will weaken your rupee, making the import expensive. So the statement is absolutely true.